That's a good point. I'm going to show something because I can. Here is a little endorsement that Lincoln wrote out in January 16th of 65. I wish it was 62 for us, but and where he's saying, "Pardon these supposed deserters." So he was known as the great pardoner, but he couldn't always be a pardoner.
No.
And he had to make cases. So give us a brief overview. It's an interesting little story of the slave trader Nathaniel Gordon.
Yes.
And what Lincoln had to go through in 62 about a pardon.
Yeah. In early 1862, Lincoln was, as he was from the beginning, under enormous pressure from the abolitionist wing of the Republican Party to take stronger, more emphatic steps to deal with slavery. The great abolitionist Charles Sumner says, "What's the point of having godlike power if not to use it godlike?" This frustration was building, and yet Lincoln had these countervailing pressures of holding Kentucky in the Union, holding the loyal slave states, and bringing along the vast northern public that didn't want to fight a war over slavery. One of the things that he tried to do was to give victories to the abolitionists short of the ultimate victory they were seeking. And the first of these that he gave was involved Nathaniel Gordon, a ship's captain from Massachusetts who had loaded up a cargo of rum and sailed it across to Africa and exchanged it for a cargo of human beings. He was overhauled on the Atlantic, arrested for slave trading, tried, and to everyone's surprise, especially Gordon's, convicted to hang. That was the ultimate penalty for slave trading, but in the entire history of the United States, no slave trader had been hanged. Gordon expected to be pardoned. People expected Lincoln to pardon him. This, as Ben Wade called, white trash from a slave state. They were sure he'd cave in. And yet Lincoln, having said to one of his friends, "You can't imagine how hard it is to have a man die when you can save his life with the stroke of a pen," he didn't give that stroke of the pen. And in late February, Nathaniel Gordon was hanged. Very big event in the history of the country. The first time federal power had been used fatally against slavery instead of to support it.
We can't go through 1862 without bringing up emancipation.
Yes.
Again, because I can do it, here is an interesting piece. This is only the fourth known signature or writing of Lincoln on the 22nd of September, 1862. We've shown this once before, but we can't get beyond without showing it once again. And it doesn't really matter what's going on here. It's not for our discussion, but it was right after, I think, he signed this poor signature, which he started to misspell his name. Not really misspell it, but use it incorrectly for
Right.
a letter. A-B, no, I don't have to do Abraham. He stopped and did Lincoln. And that's the only time he'd ever done that. The papers show that down in Springfield. So it was an amazing day, a soaring day from issuing the preliminary to an advertisement that he gave out for his foot doctor, that you mentioned earlier. And Lincoln's Doctor's Dog, by the way, is one of my favorite books. So there are good books on Lincoln in that regard, too. So tell us about that day and what it meant and how he felt about this on the 22nd of September.
Lincoln had decided privately that he would need to emancipate, issue an order for the military emancipation of Southern slaves in July. Seward persuaded him that he should wait for a Union victory to do it so that they didn't look desperate, like they were trying to stir up a murderous slave insurrection. On September 17th, the great Battle of Antietam fought in Western Maryland. For several days afterward, Lincoln later reported or recalled he didn't really know whether they'd won or lost. The reports were so sketchy, but ultimately, on the 19th, the night of the 18th and into the 19th, Lee retreated across the river, and Lincoln determined that this was the moment to announce the Emancipation Proclamation. He went in, called a cabinet meeting for the 22nd, went in. His emotional tenor in that meeting is extraordinary. He starts out by reading a comical short story by a then considered humorous writer. He gets to the end, he roars with laughter, nobody makes a sound. And he looks at him and says, "Why don't you laugh? If I couldn't laugh, I'd die under the strain of this war." So he goes from that to reading his Emancipation Proclamation. He says, "I've made up my mind, don't try to talk me out of it." There are a couple of hopeless protests, one from Montgomery Blair saying the Democrats are going to kill us with this. The off-year election was getting underway at that point. And then Lincoln says something that even he is hesitant to say. He says, "There's one other thing you should know. I don't know quite how to tell you this. You're going to think it's strange that I would have done this, but when Lee invaded Maryland, I made a promise to God that if he would let us push Lee back across the river, I would issue the Emancipation Proclamation." He says, "God has decided this in favor of the slaves." And he was right. They did think it was strange. Several of them in their diary accounts of the meeting you can see them wrestling with how to describe this. So this roller coaster of emotion that he was on that day, I find the signature so fascinating to see.
This signature shows that emotion. That's what's so interesting. It's not just that he made this mistake, but you can see it in what he was doing. And with that, this is the tremendous pressure he was on.
Right.
And we shouldn't say that even on January 1st coming up in '63, that just because he was shaking hands half the afternoon and he said his arms were tired, that's not the only reason why he was trembling before he signed the final emancipation and he had to put his pen down for a moment.
Let's remember what Lincoln was hearing from authoritative people, great leaders of the country with wonderful networks of gossip networks. He was hearing that the Army of the Potomac would lay down its weapons and go home if he issued an Emancipation Proclamation. He was hearing that George McClellan was under pressure from his friends to lead a military coup if it came to emancipation. He was hearing that, from Blair in that meeting, the Democratic Party is going to destroy us if we do emancipation. These were the pressures he was under. It was a tremendous gamble that he was taking. It was a gamble about the military. It was a gamble about the Northern electorate. And contained in that, the stakes were, not to be too melodramatic about it, Daniel, the stakes were the American experiment. And so the pressure is astonishing.
And he also had the courage to do it before the election.
Yes, and in this, I think, I'm glad you make that point. It's so important that he announced it before the election, went to the polls, and while the Republicans suffered setbacks, in fact, as James McPherson has pointed out, the Republicans had the best off-year election in the 20-year period from 1842 to 1862. Lincoln was, in that sense, ratified in his action, and that makes that one of the most important political moments of the war.
Well, he also wanted, he had that ambition. You make that point in here, something I've said for years too, that and I don't think you stole it from me, but that ambition, that little ambition that Herndon spoke about,
Yes.
the engine that was in Lincoln,
Right.
he didn't want to leave this moral coil until he had done something. And here was his remembrance for history.
Yes.
And he was able to do that. But as you mentioned, the loneliness at the top as commander-in-chief, and yes, he was issuing it as commander-in-chief. Is it a possibility that we really would have had slavery for the rest of that century if it wasn't for our man Lincoln? I'm saying our man against Jefferson, who was in here a couple of weeks ago.
Right. They, this, of course, is one of the great what-ifs. There was 100 years of history writing, largely by Southern writers, devoted to the idea that if only the Northern radicals had not brought on this terrible war, slavery would have died out peacefully. And I just don't see that. I don't believe, well, number one, in 1860, the value of human chattel in the slave states was the most valuable asset in the United States. Slaves were a larger asset base than all the railroads put together, or all the banks put together, or all the factories put together. That doesn't sound like a dying system to me.
Except, of course, they felt it because Lincoln, and because secession flowed directly from Lincoln saying, well, won't go an inch into the territories.
Not an inch farther. But some say, well, that they felt that would have killed off slavery. To me, I think it was more of an issue of why do they get all that? You know, the exploration of the West was well underway by then, and people were figuring out what was out there. You know, on the first maps, you see much of the West labeled the Great American Desert. You know, that's what they thought they were getting. Then they get out there and they find, you know, the silver mines, the gold mines, the most productive agricultural land in the world. And they wake up to the fact that there's unimaginable fortune to be made out there. And the idea that the Southerners couldn't go out and get their share was offensive, but it doesn't mean slavery was dying out. And the last point is, if the South really was about to give up slavery anyway, why did they sacrifice a quarter of their men of military age? I mean, do people really fight like that for a system that they're planning on giving up anyway?